Traditional allies are putting pressure on Israel. The UK has paused trade talks and sanctioned West Bank settlers, and the EU is threatening to review its entire relationship with Israel. Is this a turning point in international policy, and will it make any difference for Palestinians? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly by Thibault. Israel is facing condemnation from some of its strongest allies over its increasing aggression in Gaza. The UK is cancelling new trade talks and the EU is reviewing old agreements, while both are imposing sanctions on Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank. The two powers say they can't stand by while Israel expands military operations, increases airstrikes, and starves Palestinians in Gaza with its total blockade. But critics are asking why they didn't step in before. So what has really prompted this change in policy? Will the new measures be imposed? And most importantly, will any of this change the reality on the ground for Palestinians? We'll put these questions to our guests in just a moment. First, this report from Imogen Kimber.
The UK issues its harshest condemnation yet of Israel, in response to its military escalation in Gaza and continuing blockade. The British government has suspended negotiations for a new free trade agreement and summoned the Israeli ambassador, and is imposing sanctions on Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank. And the Foreign Secretary told Parliament why.
We are now entering a dark new phase in this conflict. Netanyahu's government is planning to drive Gazans from their homes into a corner of the Strip to the south, and permit them a fraction of the aid that they need.
He warned Israelis their country's relationship with the UK was at risk.
I say now to the people of Israel, I want a strong friendship with you based on shared values. We are unwavering in our commitment to your security and to your future, but the conduct of the war in Gaza is damaging our relationship with your government.
The EU, Israel's largest trading partner, has voted to review its trade cooperation deal with the country and is assessing whether its government is breaching its human rights obligations according to their agreement. And it's imposing sanctions on Israeli settlers.
This initiative has given a very clear signal to Europe, but also to Israel, that we are very seriously concerned about the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, that we want to see a full lifting of the humanitarian blockade of the Gaza Strip, and that we're very concerned about the intensified war effort.
But the Dutch foreign minister also emphasised his and the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen's, friendship with Israel. The Israeli government quickly denounced the UK's decision, saying it would not succumb to external pressure and the move would damage the UK's economy. But some denounced the government's action, saying it's too little, too late. Existing trade between the two countries is worth around $78 billion. And while the government suspended 30 of its 350 licences for British exporting arms to Israel, in September 2024, more than $170 million worth of sales went ahead. Many people are now waiting to see whether these policy changes will be fully enacted, and if they are enough to make a real impact on Israel and on Palestinians living under constant attack and blockade in Gaza. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's now bring in our guests for today's show. Joining us from Brussels is James Moran, a former EU ambassador to Egypt and Jordan. In London is Yossi Mekelberg, a senior consulting fellow at Chatham House. And here in Doha is Zaid Belbagi, managing partner of Hardcastle Advisory and a political commentator. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us on Inside Story. Ambassador Moran, if I can start with you, is Europe finally shifting its stance on Israel, or is this just diplomatic posturing?
I think it's a little bit of both, Folly, but it is clearly an important moment because the talk of a review of the EU-Israel Association Agreement has been on the table for quite some time now. But it's never been a majority of member states asking for it. Now there is. 17 of the 27 have done it, and there will be a review now based on the Article 2 of the Association Agreement, which commits both sides to the protection of human rights and the rule of law. It has been difficult, and indeed, I think still around 8 or 9 EU member states did not agree to this review. But the review does send a message to Israel for the first time that the overall relationship between the EU and Israel is now in some question. Right. Whether or not this review will lead to a suspension is another story.
Let me ask you, Ambassador Moran, why the EU has waited this long after months of siege and reports of famine to begin distancing itself from Israel. What threshold finally triggered this move, you think?
Well, I think without any question, it is the situation in Gaza, of course, which has caused this. The latest developments in Gaza with Israel once again starting a military campaign to bomb more people, kill more people, create yet more rubble in Gaza has, I think, sent many European governments over the top. But in addition, for a very long time in Europe, in most European countries, there has been rising noise from public opinion, whether it be demonstrations, civil society, and so forth, right across Europe. And that finally has had some effect, I think, on the politicians in Europe as well. But at the moment, we're still in the business of language and diplomatic declaration. We're not yet in the business of actually taking serious measures.
Right.
We'll have to wait and see.
We're not in the business of sanctions just yet. Zaid, let me come to you. Is the dam breaking in your view? Are these European nations, you think, genuinely concerned now about what's happening to Palestinians in Gaza, or are they more worried about the political consequences at home and also the international consequences in the future?
I think the point you made in your opening remark about it being too little too late does have a role. However, what has become clear is that the situation in Gaza has made the relationship with the Israeli government and formerly European partners untenable. When this war started, there wasn't a capital city in Europe which wasn't echoing Israeli government messaging. But that's a world away from the situation now, where the way this war has been conducted and the way in which Israeli politicians have presented themselves in this new iteration of a nativist, insular, inward-looking Israel is having some real effects on its international relationships, and importantly, those with the EU. At the moment, these are harsh words, but should they present themselves as a downgrade of trade relations, a downgrade in security partnerships, then this has significant consequences for Israel at a time when there are several major powers talking about recognizing a Palestinian state. If I were decision-making in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem today, I'd be incredibly worried about this.
Yossi, your thoughts. What are decision makers in Tel Aviv thinking today? I mean, we've heard the official Israeli response. We've seen it as well. But privately, how do you think they're taking these measures by the European Union and these threats of sanctions?
And I think there will be a huge difference what they say in public and be very defiant about it and reclaim their independence and sovereignty and not caving in to pressure while they are fighting an enemy. But I think behind closed doors, considering that relationship with the EU and the UK are important. If you look at the level of trade between UK, EU and Israel, it's massive. With the EU, it's around 32% of Israel trade. It's close to £6 billion with the UK. They can't just ignore it, especially at the time that also the relations with Washington are quite fraught. So I think behind closed door, they'll have to take it into account and think what's the next step, how much they can make actually concessions there.
And Yossi, what about Israeli public opinion? How are they responding to this growing international isolation, it seems? And is there a sign of a shift within Israel? Some critics, including Israelis, like the retired General Yair Golan, have said the country is on its way to becoming a pariah state. Do you think that's gaining traction within Israel?
I think it's a slow process, and no doubt that Major General retired Yair Golan is leading this together with other in the protest movement are leading this line. It's very slow, and you expect that the reaction will be slow during war, but 19 months into this, because the Israeli public says all along that they support a ceasefire, see the hostages returning home, at a rate of 70% of them saying that. And also in all opinion polls, they also say that they would like to see a different government. The thing is that the election in Israel are due only late next year, but I think this government, considering what happened in October 7, and since then lost its legitimacy. And I think now from the pressure outside, people will start to think how it's going to affect Israel becoming a pariah state, how it's going to affect the economy, it is the pockets. And at the same time, those are people that also serve hundreds of days in reserve. Israeli soldiers are killed. And yeah, there are many Israelis that care about the image of Israel as a result of the horrific pictures that we see from Gaza.
Right. Ambassador Moran, let me come to you now. We've heard the strong language from the UK, from France as well. But will we see any actual sanctions? And if not, what's the credibility of these threats that we're hearing from European countries going forward?
Well, it's going to depend on what will happen over the next period. This review of the association agreement doesn't have a timeline attached to it, but probably the process will be determined, the speed of the process will be determined about what happens on the ground in Gaza. Should the Netanyahu government continue with its military operations, and should the humanitarian situation continue to worsen, or at best stay where it is, I imagine the review will be speeded up, and we could reach the point down the line when sanctions become a real possibility. But
countries, Ambassador, countries like Germany, as you mentioned before, are not fully on board with the idea of sanctions. Is there a risk then that a divided European response, a divided Western response could weaken diplomatic efforts overall?
Yes, there is. We've got to face up to that in Europe. We know that. The divisions are very deep, and they're still there. Germany, for historical reasons, of course, has a particular relationship with Israel. And you have an outlier within the EU, which is Hungary. In fact, very unlikely that the Hungarians would ever vote for sanctions. But there is a way out for that, should the situation become that much worse, which is abstentions, or so-called constructive abstentions, can be done. It's not beyond the imagination that there could reach a point where sanctions really will become a possibility, a probability for the European Union. But we're not there yet.
All right. Zaid, your thoughts. How do you assess Europe's actual leverage over Israel compared to the United States, for example?
I think it's significant. The EU is Israel's largest trade partner. This is 45 billion euros plus of trade a year between the EU and Israel. One must not forget that a lot of the Israeli government are second-generation European immigrants. Israel was born out of Europe, as Ambassador Moran said. The original sin lies with Germany, and that's why it has this peculiar relationship with Israel. However, the main European countries, the countries that matter, bar Germany, did support this revision of the EU-Israel Association Agreement. Israel risks being in the company of Hungary and Lithuania and fringe members of the European Union, when larger countries like France and Spain have been very clear, and the Dutch, etc., that this cannot continue. So though Germany may be an outlier, and it may be later to the table, the fact that these very previously staunch supporters of Israel, including the UK, including France, have changed their narrative is incredibly significant. So
Right,
I wouldn't worry too much about Germany.
But Zaid, I mean, how will that actually translate into meaningful protection for Palestinians on the ground, a policy change on the ground for Palestinians? I mean, yes, there could be sanctions on Israel, which could affect Israel, but what would it mean for Palestinians?
The most meaningful change within the next few hours, few days, is in letting in aid. The withholding of food is a war crime, internationally understood as such. You would have heard the UN's aid coordinator and relief coordinator saying yesterday that 14,000 babies in Gaza are at risk of dying. Should the EU throw its weight behind at least food and aid going in, this will, to answer your question, affect facts on the ground. This is immediate, it is urgent, and that's the best way I think the EU can lend moral leadership. And then on the 17th of June, we have the big summit in New York at the United Nations, where I think if Saudi, French, British, Canadian diplomacy works, we may see the recognition of a Palestinian state, which really throws the Israeli narrative by the wayside and would be something that decision makers are incredibly concerned about.
Yossi, your thoughts about what Zaid just said there. He talked about aid, and this week Prime Minister Netanyahu addressed his decision to send a trickle of aid into Gaza, seeming to suggest that the decision to allow aid was not made out of compassion, but to keep the war going, right? So what do you think the end game is right now for Netanyahu? And in light of this growing international pressure, especially from traditional allies, where do you think he's likely to take the war?
Yeah. I think the way that Netanyahu deals with humanitarian, the government, they get the worst of all worlds. At the one hand, they seem that they're susceptible to pressure, but when they allow only 9-10 trucks, where we know you need at least 500-600 trucks to enter Gaza, they don't seem as very compassionate and caring about the people, the Palestinian people of Gaza, that we know that everyone in Gaza right now face food insecurity and quarter are facing possibly starvation. But the fact that under pressure they allow something should suggest that we're reaching up the pressure, and it's not only the EU and Canada, but I think it's important it comes also from the United States, that maybe there is a chance there that more trucks, more humanitarian aid. At this moment, probably the two most important things is A, they allow more humanitarian aid, and B, to avert what Israel call Gideon's Chariots operation. But we know this will be on large scale. It will result in many more killed and worsening the humanitarian aid by a factor of we don't even know how bad. So I think this is the most important thing. We also heard from the United Nations, from Tom Fletcher, the Undersecretary, UN Undersecretary for humanitarian issues, also the warning of starvation. That's why the international community should come together and say the international community supported Israel at the beginning of the war, but it has to come to an end because we see the results of it.
Ambassador Moran, will the international community come together, in your opinion? We're not just talking about the Europeans here, but eventually the Americans also. We've seen President Trump travel to the region. I mean, the relationship seems to be a bit ambiguous right now. He came to the region without going to Israel. Can the Europeans count on the US at some point as they deal with Israel?
Who knows, Folly? Who knows? The Trump administration famously is very unpredictable. It does seem, and we know that there have been difficulties in the personal relationship between Mr. Trump and Mr. Netanyahu. That may be playing in the background as well. One thing I think that's interesting is that these new moves in Europe, whether it be at the EU level or the national level, France saying it intends to recognize Palestine, etc., to my knowledge, we haven't seen much pushback, if any, from the US. I may be wrong, but I have not seen anything coming out publicly anyway from the US objecting to what Europe is doing at the moment. In the past, they usually have objected. This time, I don't think they have, which may tell you something. But again, who knows with the Trump administration? I wouldn't want to be too enthusiastic about their support for anything other than Israel, given the record. But at the moment, anything might be possible. Who knows?
All right. Zaid, your thoughts about the Trump administration? I mean, support from the Trump administration towards Israel, again, has been somewhat ambiguous recently, especially with the recent trip by Trump to the region. The unequivocal support by the US seems to be in doubt, some would say. Do you agree with that? And do you think that would make a difference for Netanyahu's calculations, if not the European actions?
I think in circumstances where it often feels like the tail is wagging the dog in the relationship between the two, something has now changed. Trump's visit, in which he didn't see Israel, was significant. And Israel, I think, is at risk of being outside of new linkages and partnerships that are being drawn around the world. You would have seen the UK-US free trade agreement, the UK-India free trade agreement, the reset in UK-EU trade, and the US Global Partnership for Infrastructure, which is meant to connect India with the Mediterranean and the Gulf, etc. This is dependent upon Israel being a paid-up member of the region. Should Israel persist in being an insular-looking, non-Middle Eastern power and reality, then it risks not being part of these new trade relationships, which affects the way that Trump looks at this. The president's team tell me that following the very highly publicized visit of Itamar Ben-Gvir to Mar-a-Lago, the president was not happy with how that went. He was not happy with how Ben-Gvir behaved. And I think that shows cracks in the relationship. You would have seen that in Doha and in Saudi Arabia, the president did say that we can look forward to big things. Now, as Ambassador Moran said, the Trump administration is incredibly ambiguous, though he does like the Arab world, has a close affinity with Arab leaders, and won't be somebody who's that difficult to convince about the humanitarian catastrophe that's going on and that his friends are becoming increasingly a liability.
Your thoughts, Yossi. Zaid says there are cracks in the US-Israel relationship. If indeed unequivocal US support for Israel is in doubt today, do you think that will make a difference in Netanyahu's calculations and what he's trying to achieve, his endgame in Gaza, whatever that is?
You know, the unknown is greater than the known with Trump. And I sense completely contradictory messages. Yes, we see that, for instance, to agree to a ceasefire with the Houthis in Yemen, it didn't include stopping the attacks on Israel. Is unilateral decision without taking into consideration what Israel thinks about negotiating a nuclear deal with Iran. It's a fact. Not visiting Israel while visiting the Gulf. So we see that, but at the same time, he still talks about reconstructing Gaza without Palestinians. So he actually fueling this kind of ideas into the head of the right wing. I think that's all what they need, the kind of tailwind to hear from an American president talking about Gaza without Gazan people. I think this is dangerous. He keep changing or sending this kind of mixed messages. But at the same time, we know that Trump is transactional, and if he can't get a success, either he get upset and leave the issue or doubles down on what, and he can double down on Netanyahu and demand a ceasefire.
Let me ask you briefly, Yossi, we talked about the external pressure, of course, but within Israel, could Israeli security or military officials eventually put the pressure on the government if this backlash was to intensify?
I think at a certain point when you think that really this government is putting Israel under threat in the relations with the rest of the world, they will definitely say things behind closed door. And we saw what happened, for instance, the relations between Netanyahu and the head of the internal security, the Shabak. And I think that the same case goes when he talks behind closed doors with the chief of staff and other of the generals. But, if you look at the history, the day of Israel, at the end of the day, the IDF does what the government asks it to do. If there is going to be a real point of crisis when they think that it puts at risk also of themselves, of one day being accused of war crimes, it will be interesting to see how they're going to react to this.
All right. Ambassador Moran, let's bring it back to our initial question. Are we now at a turning point in this crisis? And will European countries ultimately follow through with their threats of sanctions, do you think?
I think we're at the corner of the street and looking around it to some extent. I'm not sure I would want to describe this as a turning point. Israel still has a lot of support inside Europe. Mainly from governments, not so much from the public. Israel has lost a great deal of sympathy over the last year or two since this war began. And that pressure from the public opinion in Europe is going to continue, and I think will also continue to have an effect on politicians here in Europe. It will depend very much on what happens on the ground. If the humanitarian situation now improves substantially, and I mean substantially, not 100 trucks, but 600 trucks, if there is a real prospect of a ceasefire, then it could turn the other way. But so long as things carry on like this, so long as the Netanyahu government pursues this Folly that it is currently set upon, I think we will continue to move in Europe towards real damage to the relationship with Israel, and we'll see what happens after that. Whether or not all of this is going to have a fundamental effect on the Israeli administration, one's bound to wonder. It is the United States, first and foremost, which matters most in terms of external influence in Israel. And we shouldn't forget that. And we're dealing with an administration there, which, as Zaid and others have said, and Yossi as well, is, well, rather difficult to read.
All right, Zaid, your final thoughts. I mean, the ambassador is right to say that the U.S. matters, but ultimately the people who matter the most in all of this are the Palestinian people, of course. What kind of international intervention, you think, Zaid, or accountability would Palestinians see as a credible gesture, a credible move at this point?
Based on what the ambassador said, and then I'll get back to your point, I think that we are at a corner. I think this is the situation the Thatcher government was in vis-à-vis apartheid, when international pressure on South Africa became so significant that even the Thatcher government had to back down. I think in previous Israeli governments, there was significant political thought and intellectual heft that these kinds of decisions would not get to where Israel is now. I think there's significant hubris and arrogance amongst certain extremists in the Israeli government, which are making their situation very, very difficult and could result in sanctions. In terms of the Palestinians, I think what the Palestinians most need and most want after the immediate humanitarian requirements that they have is serious, credible, uncorrupt leadership. Because the biggest impediment to this entire story is Palestinian leadership that is out of date, antiquated and corrupt, and frankly, a gifted and well-meaning people like the Palestinians can do much, much better than the 88-year-old Abbas, who is from another era and frankly a spent political force.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for a fascinating discussion. Thank you for sharing your views with us. Ambassador James Moran, Yossi Mekelberg, and Zaid Belbagi, thank you so much for joining us on Inside Story. And thank you, too, for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And, of course, you can join the conversation on X. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. Bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.